For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. Verse 6, but now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. Now, verse 5 and 6 is actually the key to unlocking the whole chapter. 5 and 6 is what the whole chapter is about. Verse 5 is talking about an unregenerate person while they were in Adam, before they were saved. And it says, for while we were living in the flesh. So this is when you are in Adam, when you're born of the flesh. Because when you're in Christ, you're born of the Spirit. And so actually when you're in Christ, you're in the Spirit. So anyone who is in Christ is no longer in the flesh. In fact, Romans 8 verse 9 tells us that. It says, but you are not in the flesh if in fact the Spirit of Christ dwells in you. And so anyone who is in Christ is in the Spirit, and you're no longer in the flesh. Now you can do fleshy things, but it doesn't mean that you're in the flesh, you are in the Spirit. But before you're born again, you are in the flesh, because you haven't been born of the Spirit. You've only been born of flesh, and that flesh is the sinful flesh of Adam. And so when you were in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. And we're going to see that most of this chapter is actually talking about this state, the state of when we were living in the flesh. And so if you're in the flesh, it means you are dead in sin, you're in Adam, and you have a sinful nature inside of you, and you are under the law. You have a conscience, the knowledge of good and evil. And so our sinful passions, the sinful nature in us was aroused by the law. And so when our conscience says, don't do that, that's wrong, the sinful nature in us said, no, do it, it's good. And so whenever the law came to tell us not to do something, the sinful nature in us wanted to do it. And so this war was going on inside of us between our sinful nature and our conscience. And this war was at work in our members, our body parts. And it caused us to bear fruit for death. In other words, our sinful nature was more powerful than our conscience. And so even though we wanted to do good things, we had a sinful nature in us, leading us into sinful things and causing us to sin with our bodies. And so that is the state that everyone is in who is still in the flesh, who is not born again and in Christ and in the Spirit. That is the unregenerate state. And then verse 6 is the regenerate state. This is someone who gets born again. Because he says, but now we are released from the law. And when he says the law, he's actually talking about the position of being under the law, the state of when we were in the flesh, in Adam, under the law. Okay? But he's saying, but now we've died to that. We've died to the law. We've died to being in the flesh. We've died to the sinful nature. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive. So we were held captive in Adam under the law. And there was nothing that we could do to make ourselves righteous. We were condemned by the law, and we were overpowered by sin. And the Bible actually says we were dead in sin and in the uncircumcision of our sinful nature. But now we've been released from that, and we've been released from that captivity. This is really important. We've been released from that captivity by dying with Christ to it, and then coming alive with Christ into a whole new place, a whole new state. Romans 6 says newness of life. It says, so that we serve in the new way, not the old way of in the flesh, but the new way of the Spirit, and not the old way of the written code. And so this is absolutely key for understanding the rest of this chapter, because you have to know in this chapter when it is speaking about unregenerate people versus regenerate people. When it's speaking about someone who is in the flesh, struggling with their sinful nature, versus someone who is in the Spirit and actually now has been set free from that old captivity.